It wasn't just one dog. They realized that as they walked across the wide space in front of the hotel. There were two dogs, two different howls. The snow here was ice, packed solid by heavy boots. They slid a bit, and Tom fell. He wasn't hurt. He laughed, and Johnny helped him up. They moved towards a high wire fence. There were lights here too, much higher than the street lights in Dublin. But it was darker than the front of the hotel. They were moving nearer the trees too, and they could hear the wind in the branches, and the lights swayed. The wind made a singing, screeching noise, and in it Johnny heard the howls of the dogs, and he knew. There were more than two dogs. Lots more. They reached the fence. It was way up over them, like a fence around a prison. They were really cold for the first time. The snow had seeped through their gloves. They were nearer the howls now. "It's just dog noise," said Tom. "Yeah," said Johnny. They kept going. Johnny saw the lane beside the fence to their right. He pointed and walked that way. He walked differently on the ice. He had to lift his legs higher than usual, and put each foot down flat on the ground, and he held his arms out from his sides. It was either that or slide. They got to the entrance of the lane and saw that it widened ahead of them. A high branch swayed and blocked the nearest light. They were right under the trees. They formed one side of the lane. Tom could hear them groan, and something, a branch, some ice, snapped not far away. Tom moved closer to his brother. They stopped. It was really, really cold. "Look!" A line of them. Snowmobiles. Parked side by side, about 10 of them. "Cool!" Tom wasn't frightened now. He hadn't really been frightened anyway. There were people around somewhere, people who parked their snowmobiles. They walked towards the snowmobiles, and now, ahead of them, a good bit, they saw small, stomach-high sheds that they both guessed were kennels. It was like a village of kennels. The kennels were great, real dog-houses. They couldn't see the dogs yet, but Johnny could smell them. "God!" Tom laughed. "Dog breath," he said. Then he heard a howl that didn't sound funny. He kept going, close to Johnny, over the icy ground, nearer to the kennels, and the first dog he noticed was standing on the roof of his kennel, staring at Tom. And there was another in front of his kennel, eating from a bowl, and another beside him, drinking water, all staring at Tom. The wind was blowing straight at Johnny. It was cold and almost solid. It made his eyes dry. The dogs were silent now, but they were looking straight at him and Tom, even the ones that were eating. He could hear their teeth. "They're not that big," said Tom, quietly. Johnny could hardly hear him. "Look," said Johnny. "They're chained." The chains were long and fixed to the sides of the kennels. One of the dogs howled, and others all around joined in. It was a noise that Johnny didn't hear that much from dogs at home, but it wasn't that fierce or frightening. The huskies were chained, but they were wagging their tails and yapping. They really weren't as big as Johnny had expected, and they didn't look too wild. 2 or 3 of them stretched their chains to get to Johnny and Tom, but they didn't lunge at them or growl. None of them barked. They were curious, and the smell made the boys laugh. Tom had never seen so much poo. It was all over the place, sitting on the snow, lodged in the ice, steaming new and ancient. He walked carefully. He was in among the dogs. He could see the breath and feel the heat on his cheeks, even though he didn't bend or go too near. "Look at their eyes," said Johnny. Tom was already looking at them. They all had the most amazing eyes. One of them, pure white, had a different colour for each eye, a brown one and a blue. And one of them, Johnny saw, had different colours in one eye. He was going to show it to Tom, when they were suddenly in front of one dog that made them stop. It wasn't that the dog snarled, or even growled. It was nothing like that. He stepped away from his kennel and kind of turned, just a bit, to face them. And he stood there, still, in front of them. They knew. He was blocking their way. A leader. Maybe the leader. They knew, and they didn't have to say it. They didn't move. They stayed still and looked at the dog's eyes. "What colour are they?" said Johnny. "Don't know," said Tom. The eyes were like nothing the boys had ever seen before. There really was no name for their colour. "Blue?" said Tom. "No," said Johnny. "Turquoise?" "Not really." The dog stared back at them. He stood there in the dirty snow, as calm as anything, and looked at the boys, at Tom, and then at Johnny, at Tom, then Johnny. They weren't really like a dog's eyes at all. "It's like there's someone trapped in there," said Tom. Johnny nodded. He knew exactly what Tom meant. They stepped back, still looking at the dog. They were afraid to turn their backs on him. They stepped back again, into thick, clean snow. They did it again, and bumped into something hard. They turned, and looked up at the biggest, tallest, widest man they'd ever seen. The man was a solid wall in front of them. The dog was right behind them. "Why are you here?" said the man. Tom had to look up and up to see him properly. He had to stretch his neck right back. He hoped he'd see a smile when he got to the man's face, but there was no smile. "You should not be here," said the man. "Sorry," said Tom. The dogs around them were pulling their chains and whimpering. The man said something in Finnish to the dogs. They were pulling at their chains, trying to drag the dog-houses to the man. They liked him. Johnny could see that, and so could Tom. But that didn't make him a nice man. A murderer could be nice to his dog. The man stood huge in front of them, right over them. He had a knife on his belt, like one of the ones they'd seen in the hotel, but longer. They both saw it at the same time. It was hanging there, in front of their eyes. It was old and used-looking. The blade was scratched. The wood of the handle was black from years of sweat, and maybe blood. Johnny felt something behind his knee. The dog. His left knee. The dog poked it with his nose, like he wanted to topple him. Johnny didn't look. He heard the dog sniff. He felt its breath through his trousers. He thought he did. "Come," said the man. They got out of his way. It wasn't easy, the ice and poo. He walked between Johnny and Tom, and he walked through the dogs, past the kennels. He wasn't wearing a hat or a cap. The dogs pulled at their chains. They whimpered. The boys looked at each other and followed the man to a wall behind the kennels. There were bales of straw, covered by a big blue sheet of plastic. The man pulled back the plastic. It exploded in the wind. That was what it sounded like. It lifted and flapped and tried to fly away. He shook it and threw it onto the dirty snow. He kicked a rock onto it. It still lifted and dropped, but couldn't escape. The boys stayed well back. "Come," said the man. The bales were up to their heads, a little higher. They were like huge bricks. He picked a bale from the top and turned to the boys. He held it out. "Take." Johnny stepped nearer to the man, and Tom followed him. They were under the bale now. It was too big for their arms. The man lowered it. They moved further apart. He held it between them. They put their hands out, under the bale. He let go. "God," said Tom. "Heavy?" "Yeah." "Not heavy." He pointed to the nearest kennel. "Go." They dropped the bale before they got to the kennel, but they knew what they were doing now. They carried it a bit more, and got it to the kennel. The dog came and sniffed at it. The man looked down at the boys. He took the knife from his belt. He wiped it on his red jacket. He looked at them and bent down. He cut the bale twine. He didn't wear gloves. He put his fists in the straw. He pulled out a big handful. Straw swirled in the wind. Tom felt it rough on his cheek. The man walked up to the first kennel. He kicked the roof off it. The explosion and clatter made the dogs mad, just for a second. The man bent down, put his other hand into the kennel. He took out old wet straw. He turned back to the boys. He held up the wet straw. Take out. He held up the new straw. Put in. He put the knife back in his belt. Jesus, lads, said Sandra when they walked into the room an hour later. Where are you going with that smell? We were helping the man, said Tom. What man? Don't come in. Take your boots off first. Sandra watched her boys take their boots off. She could tell they were frozen. They could hardly bend their legs. What man was this? He's in charge of the dogs. What's his name? Don't know, said Tom. He didn't tell us. Why didn't you ask him? He isn't that kind of a man, said Johnny, and Tom nodded. What work were you doing? Said Sandra. Putting straw in the kennels and stuff, said Tom. Can we come in now? I suppose so, said Sandra. But stinky poo, lads. Johnny didn't like that word. It was from when he was a little kid. But he came and got up on the bed beside Sandra. What are the dogs like? Brilliant. Brilliant. Big day tomorrow, so? Yeah. They sat on the bed and told her all about the dogs and the kennels and the man and the snowmobiles. But there was one thing they didn't tell her. Tom had bought a knife. The airport. The plane was delayed. Half an hour. EI 156. That was the name and number, and it was late. She sat. She'd waited all her life, most of her life. It was still dark outside. There weren't many people waiting. There was no one she knew or she'd ever seen before. She sat where she could see the screens that showed the arrival times. She took the photograph from her bag again. She put it back. She looked at the waiting people. It was getting busier. She looked at the screen. She looked at it at the same time a new word appeared. Landed. End of chapter 3 and the airport.